Academic writing poses many challenges. It can be very different from other sorts of writing you've had to do in the past. Writing about history, in particular, comes with its own set of conventions and expectations, which may take some getting used to. The goal of this short video is not to master every aspect of good historical writing, but to point out a few pitfalls to avoid and a few helpful tips to help you improve your skills as a writer. We're going to briefly go over 4 topics. First, using quotations effectively. Second, avoiding the passive voice. Third, paying attention to tense. And fourth, responsible citation practices. Okay, let's get to it. Almost any historical writing will include quotations from a variety of sources, including primary sources and secondary literature. Effective quotation is essential to good historical writing. Illustrative quotations provide evidence for historical arguments, they provide fodder for analytical interpretation, and they offer our readers brief glimpses of the voices of the historical actors we study. Nevertheless, we are often tempted to quote too frequently or too extensively in historical writing. Remember that quotations do not speak for themselves. Never assume that your readers will interpret a quotation in exactly the same way as you do. A few simple guidelines will help you use quotations effectively. First, always provide sufficient context for your reader to understand the material from which you're quoting. Your reader should never wonder about the source of a quotation or why they're reading it. Second, paraphrase when you can, quote when you must. It might feel easy to rely on a series of quotations to make an argument for you, but this approach tends to get in the way of developing the depth and specificity of your historical analysis. Instead of quoting repeatedly, paraphrase from your sources whenever you can, using your own words to communicate your analysis and argument clearly and succinctly. Reserve quotation for instances when you want to analyze or call attention to specific language or phrasing from your sources. If you quote sparingly, each quotation you use will pack a greater punch. Third, never quote without analysis or explanation. Historical sources do not speak for themselves. Make sure to explain why you think a quotation is important, how you've interpreted it, and how it supports your argument. Let's take an example. Pause the video for a moment and read this short passage. The writing is clear here, but there's an excessive use of quotations that are unnecessary, and especially in the case of the last quotation, unexplained. What could we do to improve this paragraph? Perhaps we can paraphrase some of the unnecessary quotations and add greater explanations of the quotations that we do have. Here's a revised version of the passage. Pause the video for a second and take a look. There are a couple of ways the author has improved the paragraph. There are fewer unnecessary quotations, and the author has used paraphrasing to say some of the same things more effectively. And instead of leaving the last quotation without any explanation, the author has offered an interpretation of that quotation, explaining to the reader why it's important. Okay, on to tip number 2. Voice refers to whether the subject of the sentence acts or is acted upon. Many thoughts can be expressed using either the active or the passive voice. For example, Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood is an active voice because the subject of the sentence, Harvey, acts. On the other hand, the circulation of the blood was discovered by Harvey is in passive voice because the subject, circulation, is acted upon. Try to avoid passive constructions whenever you can. If you find yourself using the passive voice too much, it might be a sign that you need to think more carefully about who was holding the ideas or taking the actions that you're describing. Take another example. As germ theory became more widely accepted around the turn of the century, many policies were proposed that targeted individual germ carriers rather than unsanitary environments. This sentence is grammatically correct, but the use of the passive voice, policies were proposed, obfuscates who precisely was proposing the policies. It masks a lack of historical specificity. The author of this sentence would be a lot clearer if she used the active voice, stating who was making the proposals she describes. Okay, let's move on to tip number 3. Another area that can trip up those who are new to writing about history is tense. In some disciplines, it's acceptable or even recommended to write about a text or describe the events in, say, a novel in the present tense. However, in historical writing, you should almost always use the past tense to describe past events and to analyze texts, documents, and other forms of evidence produced in the past. Using the correct tense to describe ideas and events will help you write more clearly. First, it's simply more accurate. Historians try to understand and analyze past events using evidence produced in the past. Describing such events as if they were ongoing in the present could be confusing to your reader. Second, using different tenses can help orient your reader to different types of claims. Using past tense, for instance, shows you are describing ideas or actions that happened in the past. In contrast, many historians use the present perfect tense when they are talking about secondary literature or the contributions of other scholars. These tense differences can help your reader to tell the difference between when you're discussing historical events and when you're discussing the scholarly literature that has interpreted them. Likewise, using the present tense can help indicate when you are presenting your own argument or analysis. Above all, make sure that your use of the present and past tenses are clear and consistent throughout your writing. Tip number 4. Cite sources consistently and responsibly. In any form of academic writing, you must cite sources consistently. Careful citation is how historians show their work and acknowledge their intellectual debts to other scholars. Quoting, taking ideas from, or paraphrasing someone else's writing without proper citation constitutes plagiarism, a serious breach of academic ethics. If you'd like to learn more about avoiding plagiarism, we have a whole Toolbox video that you can consult. But even students who know they are supposed to cite sources sometimes wonder how to do so appropriately. Historians use footnotes or endnotes rather than parenthetical notes to cite sources. There are several styles for properly formatting footnotes and bibliographies, but the most common style among historians comes from the Chicago Manual of Style, which is also a handy reference guide for almost any question you have about the mechanics of writing, from punctuation and grammar to commonly misused words and how to prepare a text for publication. CMS is available online and also as a Hopkins e-resource, which you can access through the library website. The Chicago Citation Guide is a primer on how to properly cite most kinds of sources in footnotes and bibliographies, including books, journals, newspaper articles, websites, etc. And if you have questions about how to best cite a source, you can always ask your instructor. So, to review, we've gone over 4 topics in this video: using quotations effectively, avoiding passive voice, paying attention to tense, and responsible citation practices. You can find additional resources for improving your writing at the links on the screen.